Thank you so much, and thank you to the organisers for this opportunity. Indeed, my night has been short because I'm currently in Washington, but just so you don't feel bad, I did come from Geneva yesterday, so I've got jet lag anyway and I was awake. So I would like to present to you today a partnership between my institute, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, with IFPRI and Cornell. And the partnership is called CERES 2030. And it is a project which is trying to combine economic modelling on the one hand with a review of evidence about what the most effective ways are to achieve SDG 2. You can pass to the first slide. And we do this, we combine economic modelling with evidence about what works to try and provide principally donors with a menu of options about how they can make better investment decisions to achieve SDG 2. We don't look at the whole of SDG 2. We focus on 3 of the sub-targets, SDG 2.1, so undernourishment, 2.3, incomes and productivity for small-scale producers, and 2.4, sustainable agriculture. And what we do is, on the one hand, we build an economic model that incorporates those 3 sub-targets, while simultaneously reviewing the evidence that's available on what are the most effective policy interventions to achieve those 3 sub-targets. And we try and find evidence that has a quantitative aspect so that ultimately what we find from the evidence can be plugged back into the economic model to generate financial costs that can help guide donor decision-making. So I'm going to start by just sharing a bit about the evidence review side of the work, and then a bit more about the economic modelling side of the work. So for the evidence review, what it's going to include is a series of, excuse me, 8 systematic reviews that are going to be published as a special issue of the journal, the peer-reviewed Journal of Nature.
Carin, we don't hear you anymore. Please stay with us.
Can you hear me again?
Yes, yes, fantastic, please.
Okay, so if we can move to the next slide. I want to share with you, we've already selected the 8 topics that will feature in this special journal issue of Nature. And the way we did that was we first started by looking at what was in the SDG 2 sub-targets and indicators. And then we spoke with a number of global experts to try and get a sense of what they thought the key priorities were. This consultation with experts was accompanied by a machine learning exercise where we scanned through dozens of databases and looked at over 50,000 articles that looked at SDG 2.3 and 2.4 to try and see where there was the most evidence. We then took those topics, narrowed it down to about 30 broad topics, and again then went and discussed with a number of experts on what they thought the most relevant were. And based on that, we've come up with a list of 8 topics, which you see on the board. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to say, give you a few examples. One of the topics, for example, looks at how we can support small-scale producers to reduce pre- and post-harvest losses along the value chain. So things like on- and off-farm storage. We are going to look at livestock interventions that can contribute to more integrated farming systems. We're going to look at the types of farm interventions that can help increase incomes in water-scarce regions. And we're going to look at interventions that can help improve opportunities for rural youth. So there's 8 topics in general. They're quite broad, but those are some of the issues that are going to come up in the review of the evidence. Next slide. The next slide I'll go through quickly. It just shows you the process that we go to do these systematic evidence reviews and what the author teams are going to be, the process they will be going through from now until the end of the year. You can move on to the next slide. What I now want to turn to is the modelling part. How do we then take the findings from the evidence and plug it back into the model? So with the modelling side, the first challenge is to design the economic model that includes the dimensions of SDGs 2.1, 2.3 and 2.4. And this is based on earlier work that was done by IISD and IFPRI when the SDGs were first adopted, which focused very narrowly on measuring the cost of how to achieve SDG 2.1, so how to end hunger. And so we're going to start with that model. That model was one that also tried to identify what the donor share of that contribution should be. So we're going to start with that model and we're going to integrate SDGs 2.3 and 2.4. So small-scale producers and environmental sustainability or sustainable agriculture. What this slide shows you is how we try to address the full scope of SDG 2.1, 2.3 and 2.4. And how well we're able to integrate these issues into an economic model. For those of you who have done or have seen any modelling before, we use a CGE model, a computable general equilibrium model, and we combine that model with data from households. So we use household surveys, the data from household surveys, combined with this CGE model, which gives us not only the macroeconomic view of what's happening in a particular country, but also the micro view of what's happening in a household. And that allows us to make sure that spending is optimized, is targeted directly to the hungry households, rather than just providing spending based on national averages. I'll skip the next slide in the interest of time, but I wanted to show you how we moved from the SDG 2 indicators to actual quantitative targets in the model. And here you'll see that in order to achieve SDG 2.1, we have the hunger target. In order to deal with SDG 2.3, we look at the doubling of smallholder productivity and incomes. And in SDG 2.4, we're using the Paris commitments as the target for what we want countries to achieve. And we do that by looking at 4 dimensions of environmental sustainability: fertilizer use, energy use, land use, and water use. And we use greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture as a proxy for the amount of fertilizer, energy, and land that's being used. And for the water use, what we're going to do is track the amount of water that's going to be used to try and achieve these targets. Next slide. So I'm done there. We had a slide. Yes, the timeline. Thank you. So this is my last slide. It just shows you a bit the timeline of the project. So as you can see, we started in 2018. This year, we're going to focus on building that evidence base and identifying the interventions that are most effective at achieving the SDG 2 sub-targets, and designing that modelling framework that we can then take the evidence from and plug it back into the model to generate both costs at an individual level, in a country level, and at a global level. Yeah, I will end there, and happy to answer any questions about the project. Thank you.